I'm going to introduce our speaker today. As I mentioned, we have Tom Montufol. He's a consultant on cybersecurity and has worked with banks, healthcare companies, and the federal government for 30 years, including 10 years spent with the intelligence community, which I assume is going to be an important background for this particular topic. He holds graduate degrees in philosophy and computer science. Also mention that Tom is teaching a class this semester with Encore Learning called Renaissance Art in Northern Europe. And the class begins first week in October. So if that's something that you're interested in, please navigate to the Encore Learning site and sign up for it. So I am ready to turn this over to Tom and then sit back like the rest of you and enjoy what I think will prove to be a very interesting presentation. Tom, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for showing up. Okay. As David said, our topic under discussion is cybersecurity. And I do want to say at the outset that nothing I'm going to say today is a result of the work that I did for either the federal government or any of its consultants. If I did, I wouldn't be able to talk about it. This is all information that is in the public press. The U.S. has, of course, a marvelous free enterprise press. And much of the story of cybersecurity actually is covered, although it tends to be a little bit more obscure than it should be. So my hope today is to demystify a little bit of that. I want to start with a very familiar episode recently this year, actually, last spring. We're all familiar with the major headlines that went out from a break-in at the Colonial Pipeline Company. This is the largest deliverer of gasoline and jet fuel to the eastern seaboard. Approximately half of the oil that flows through the Colonial Pipeline. They were hacked. They were subject to ransomware. And they immediately did two things. First of all, on April 29th, hackers entered the back office, the corporate network. A week later, ransomware hit the back office network, and they basically were frozen at that point from an office point of view. Their operational network, though, which actually runs the pipelines, was not hit. And the company made a corporate business decision at the time to shut down that operations network. Why? Basically because they wouldn't be able to charge for the gasoline that was flowing through the system. So even though the pipeline itself was not part of the hack, the company chose to shut down, and that is what led to the misery of running out of gas, approximately 10,000 gas stations. Shortly thereafter, the company paid a ransom of $4.4 million and was still offline for a week. So in my view, they made two major mistakes. One is to shut down their operational system even though it was not part of the hack, and the other is to pay ransom. I always think it's a bad idea to pay ransom, but it does point out that those decisions are made entirely by the owner of the network, in this case, a corporation. The US government basically has no insider involvement in that. However, this was quite definitely assessed by the US government to be a Russian cyber criminal activity. This is not a Russian or a nation state doing this. Russia was determined, this was not determined to be a national action, and therefore the US responded to it quite differently. So the first thing to keep in mind in discussing this field is, as it's evolved in the last 20 years, cybersecurity really has three quite distinct types of entity and professionals. Cybercrime. Cybercrime is now, you may or may not know, the largest source of illicit funds, exceeding now drugs. That just happened not too long ago, but it's actually more remunerative than the illegal drug market. The other is cyber warfare, and the third is cyber espionage. All three are quite distinct, and what makes them distinct is worth talking about. Cybercrime is is perpetrated by individuals, whereas cyber warfare, nation states, and cyber espionage as well. Nation states conduct cyber warfare and cyber espionage, not cyber crime, typically. We'll talk about an exception to that later. The objectives are entirely different. The cyber crime, quite obviously, to get money. Cyber warfare is interested in inflicting damage or destruction. Cyber espionage really is almost the opposite. They're very much at cross purposes with cyber warfare, and that is collecting information. So very often you will hear of disputes between, let's say in the US, the cyber warfare community and the cyber espionage community over whether or not a particular weapon should be used, because it will expose the fact that the espionage people have in fact penetrated the network. The espionage people do not want to have exposure, and there's no way to avoid exposure when you do cyber warfare. So quite often there are major disputes between those two entities. But whenever you hear of a break-in, you will shortly thereafter hear of what happened to the results. And either, if it's not a ransomware and it's pure money, if it's information that's been gleaned, either that information like social security numbers and credit card numbers and IDs and so on will be dumped for sale in the dark web, in which case it's an indicator that it was in fact cyber crime, or that will not happen. And when it doesn't happen, it's a pretty good indicator that it's either cyber warfare or cyber espionage that in fact this particular break-in falls into. But the important thing is nation states conduct that. So as opposed to the cyber crime, which we're not going to talk about today, all of the discussion today will be about activities fomented by nations. Cyber warfare is one example, and here's the definition. And the important part is it is state against state. And again, it's intended to really, it's like a weapon. It is intended to induce damage. And in fact, this is a picture of what warfare is like now. There is a cyber element of any war plan these days. We'll see an instance shortly in which pretty much cyber warfare was the opening phase, if you will, of a classic conventional warfare scenario. And that's the way it's going to be from now on. Any shooting war will almost inevitably be preceded by a cyber attack of one type or another. Cyber warfare is one of the multiple domains in which warfare is conducted. The classic ones are land, the Army, the sea, the Navy, and possibly the Marines. Air is the Air Force, space is now the new Space Force or the Air Force, depending on how you look at it. But there's this new entity called cyber as a warfare domain. Now that's a little bit odd because all of the other domains, Army, Navy, etc., have their own networks and operate in cyberspace. Nevertheless, cyberspace as a separate place in which warfare occurs is now recognized, and that is given to the purview as of about 10 years or so ago of an organization known as Cyber Command based in Fort Meade, Maryland. There are 5 ways, however, in which cyber warfare is quite different from any other type of warfare. In particular, for example, nuclear weapons. For one, cyber weapons, when deployed, hang around. They are there to be analyzed, they are left behind, and that means that anybody who, including the victim, who wants to pick it apart can look at it and see exactly how it is made. It's almost as if in dropping a nuclear war weapon, a country left behind the plans to create a new weapon. So that's something that's really quite distinct about cyber weapons as opposed to other types of weapons. Secondly, they're very difficult to trace cyber weapons to their source. If you think in terms of nuclear weapons, it's very easy to see where the ICBMs came from. Not true with cyber weapons, particularly since the more advanced nation states are quite able to somewhat disguise the source by going through multiple countries and multiple hot points. and confusing and increasing the difficulty of determining exactly where they came from. The damage can be difficult to contain, and in some cases, the damage is out of control. It's either because of accident or timing or the way the weapon occurred. It either causes far more damage or sometimes far less damage than was intended. So it's a little bit hard to predict and plan for what the damage can be. On the other hand, it can be very precisely targeted so that it does not cause damage other than what is intended. We will see that very much in regard to something called Stuxnet, which we will analyze in a few minutes. And finally, there's delivery mechanism is trivial. It's the internet. Everybody is connected to the internet, as opposed to nuclear weapons, which require, as North Korea and Pakistan and other countries now know, investment in a separate technology for ICBMs to deliver the weapons. Cyber weapons can be delivered with little effort at all. One more difference between cyber weapons and nuclear. There's nothing akin to mutually assured destruction. You may have observed that in the last 75 years or so, there has not been the use of a single nuclear weapon in hostile activity, despite the fact that there are, certainly were, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of these weapons lying around. No one has ever actually used one in combat, and that's because it would be remarkably insane to do so. Cyber weapons have no such deterrent effect. In fact, if anything, use of cyber weapons seems to have actually encouraged the further use of cyber weapons by the country that has been victimized by it. So another thing to keep in mind, very different from nuclear. Will there be a cyber war? People ask that question quite a bit. Leon Panetta used to refer to the cyber Pearl Harbor and said, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Well, the fact is, it has happened, and numerous times, actually. The first time I would point to is this area. These are the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And as you recall, they were part of the Soviet Union until the early 90s. And they actually, after the breakup of the USSR, became very much aligned with the West. And all three are now NATO countries, right at the doorstep of Russia. And boy, that sticks in their craw. I want to point specifically to Estonia. Estonia has among the highest internet usage in the world. It has free Wi-Fi everywhere. It's the first nation to conduct voting purely online. They've been doing it for over a decade now, quite safely, interestingly. The US is nowhere near being able to do that. And it's also where Skype was invented. Skype evolved into FaceTime, which you may call your grandkids on. Well, you can thank Estonia for that. The other thing about Estonia, it's where the first cyber war was launched. So we cast ourselves back to April of 2007. The denial of service attacks across the Estonian government, parliament, banks, ministries, newspapers, broadcasters, attacks aimed at shutting down networks and basically causing major inconvenience. Not so much permanent damage, but just bringing down convenient sites. The attacks followed the Estonian decision by the parliament to relocate this rather monstrous looking statue. This is a statue devoted to the heroism of the Soviet troops in World War II. And of course, that's not particularly popular in Estonia, but it is, I can tell you in Russia, they are still very much involved in honoring the World War II generation. Russia sustained far more military and civilian casualties in World War II than any other country, including Germany. And they hero worshiped those and did not like the fact that Estonia was moving their monument. And so they triggered an attack. And the upshot was that NATO, a year later, established its NATO Cyber Defense Center in Estonia. And it's been operating there ever since, fending off these attacks from Russia. About a year later, Russia, this is the first real coordinated cyber/kinetic weapons attack. Russia invaded the northern parts of Germany, sorry, not Germany, Georgia. And the first element of that attack was, in fact, a cyber offensive. And at the precise moment that Russian attacks invaded Georgia, many Georgian websites, official ones, and news agencies and so on were brought down as a way of inflicting confusion and reducing the ability to respond appropriately. So, in fact, there have been 10 years of cyber warfare, and this is only going to take it to the year 2016. We talked about the Estonian government as the first. The Russian attack on Georgia in 2008. Well, prior to the Russian attack on Georgia, Israel actually attacked a Syrian reactor and pioneered the use of cyber weapons. They actually took command of the Syrian air defense systems and put benign images on the screens while the assault was going on. Now, interestingly, although that would be considered an act of war, both Israel and Syria chose to ignore that it ever happened and deny that it ever happened. So it did not become a shooting war at that time. Instead, it simply was an embarrassment to Syria. In the summer of 2008, both the Republicans and the Democrats were, in fact, penetrated by unknown foreign attackers, likely to be Russia and possibly China at the time. It didn't seem important, and was important actually 8 years later. But in August of 2008, again, we mentioned the Georgia-Russia conflict. Israel became the victim of a cyber attack by a criminal organization paid for by the Hamas, possibly, or Hezbollah, and actually did inflict some damage on Israel at the time. In October of 2010, the famous Stuxnet, and we'll talk about that in great detail later, but this was found in Iran and a few other countries, leading to speculation that it was a cyber weapon aimed at the nuclear program. Yes. US and Israel were believed responsible. They have never formally taken credit, but everybody is of the opinion right now that that was in fact a coordinated cyber weapon, the first use of a cyber weapon in hostile activity by the United States. Cyber attack dubbed Red October, focused particularly on Eastern European nations, went on for some time actually, 6 years, and was finally discovered in 2012 and shut down in 2013. In South Korea in March, an attack on the Korean broadcasting network. Early 2014, Obama orders a secret program to sabotage North Korea's missile development program. A bit later, something called Sandworm, which is a Russian activity, was aimed at the Ukrainians by and large. And I'm not going to bring the timeline up to date because there simply would be too many activities going on. But for the 10 years between 2007 and 2016, these are a selected major events, calendar of events. And you can see quite a bit was happening. I'm going to focus, however, on Stuxnet. Stuxnet, again, is malware that was targeted to the nuclear centrifuges in Iran. And by and large, it was effective, but it did do something it was not intended to do, which is to escape into the wild. It became public and became quite noticeable at that point. It was supposed to have stayed within the Uranium network, and it escaped into the wild and became the focus of major attention. But here's where it was intended to go: the Natanz facility in the middle of Iran. This is what it looks like from the air, and this is the locus of the Iran nuclear uranium enrichment program. So here we have in 2009, Ahmad Ahmadinejad, in the process of campaigning for president of Iran, touring the Iranian facilities with a nice public picture in the wire photo of all of the centrifuges busily humming away. By the summer of 2009, Iran had approximately 839 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. Here is another shot that came out at the time, and I will tell you that down here, these screenshots were quite useful to the US and the Israelis when they developed Stuxnet, because it disclosed a good deal about how the Iranians controlled those centrifuges. But in fact, had Iran continued at this rate, it was pretty much assumed that they would have enough uranium, enriched uranium, highly enriched uranium, weapons grade to make two nuclear weapons within a year. So something had to be done. So what Stuxnet does, it's an extremely complicated piece of malware. It is 10 times the usual piece of malware. And it is targeting Windows systems, but it uses what are known as 0 days, which means exploits bugs in Windows that can be turned into exploits, but for which the vendor has no idea they exist. They are not patched, they are not patchable. So that's the term 0 days, which means Microsoft had not at the time known about these bugs. In addition, there were malware that was specifically designed to go on a programmable logic controller from Siemens called the Step 7, and only that. And the reason that was important is because that is exactly the equipment that was used to control all of those centrifuges. So what it does is it looks for the programmable logic controllers. If it doesn't find any, then it simply goes dormant. It does not do anything. So essentially, this weapon is specifically focused at a particularly environment that is specific to Iran. If found, however, it installs a rootkit, issues commands, and then once, as the Israelis did in Syria, it makes the operator screen look normal. Meanwhile, it's causing all sorts of damage to the centrifuges. This finally came out in 2012, 4 years later. David Sanger broke the story and possibly gave Obama a little bit too much credit on that. The program started under Bush, but it was carried forward by Obama and was really fairly successful. It resulted in there's argument on this, but perhaps 20% of Iran's centrifuges actually being destroyed before Iran figured out what was happening. And in fact, the enrichment, the low-level enrichment had in fact fallen significantly. Iran said several times that the enrichment, they never acknowledged there was a hack, but they acknowledged a technical problem. They also reported a serious nuclear accident, quote unquote, shutting down its centrifuges. The the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization lost its job because of it. And the IAEA up in Vienna, which is monitoring these Iranian sites, recorded that approximately 900 to 1,000 of the centrifuges actually had to be dismantled and removed during the period Stuxnet was operating. So overall, it was successful. But again, it specifically focuses on equipment and it used quite a number of zero-day exploits. Zero-day exploits are extremely rare. Exploits are not that uncommon. Let's say of all the thousands of bugs in software, maybe 1 in 10,000 can be made into an exploit. Pick a number, maybe 1 in 1,000 of those that can be made into exploits are actually worms. Actually, we're coming to that. According to the 0 days, the film was modified. This film, which is still available, the Israelis were the ones that were responsible for the fact that Stuxnet escaped into the world by making it more aggressive. So, was this an active war? I can tell you before it happened, I am certain there were lots of major discussions and debates as to whether or not Iran would perceive this as an attack on their territory, as they certainly would had it been a missile attack on the same facilities. And yet they did not. They did not, interestingly enough. However, since that point, from that point on, the Stuxnet code has been available and analyzed and has become a major educational force for actors, both offense and defense, both in hostile nations as well as allies. And it basically was a way of bringing everybody a little bit up to speed. This is an extremely sophisticated weapon, and it showed the world really how sophisticated the US cyber weapons had become. So it had the effect, unintended of course, of narrowing the gap between the abilities, the capabilities in cyberspace of the US and the same capabilities in the rest of the world. Iran began a series of hacking back, not so much against the US, but a short time later, actually 4 years later, Iran attacked the facilities, the petroleum facilities of Saudi Aramco. This is by far the largest petroleum company in the world, owned entirely by the Saudis. The corporate network was struck. 35,000 computers were completely inoperable. That is, they were turned into bricks. Some screens showed a burning US flag just as a messaging. The CEO of Aramco was doxxed. That's a word that hackers use to mean their name and address and so forth are in fact publicly made knowledge. And this is the first use by Iran of a cybersecurity weapon. And it actually inflicted significant damage. Interestingly, Aramco did not shut down its operational network. It kept going and basically gave away the oil during that period, just because shutting down the pipelines at that point would have wreaked havoc worldwide. And they were willing to absorb the cost of giving away the gasoline so as not to completely damage their supply lines. Next, a year later, a couple years later, the Sands Casino was attacked. The reason that's important is because it's owned by this gentleman, a man by the name of Sheldon Adelson. Sheldon Adelson, in a conference in New York, said at one point, and asked about what about negotiating with Iran? He said, what is there to negotiate about? What I would say is, you see that desert out there? I want to show you something. And then he proceeded to talk about how somebody, no unnamed, US or Israel, should launch a cruise missile and blow up an uninhabited part of the desert and demonstrate to them that if Iran ever gets a nuclear weapon, it's going to be obliterated. Well, that didn't sit well. That was a YouTube video that was closely watched in Iran. And sometime later, 6 months later, thousands of computers at the Sands network in Las Vegas were wiped out. They were, the casino website was defaced, some sensitive company files were dumped, and approximately $40 million total in damage. So moderately successful hackback, if you will. And since then, the warfare from Iran has become a matter of pretty much everyday tit for tat. Here's a recent story in the New York Times. Israel hack of Iran port is latest salvo in salvage of cyber attacks. Israel was behind a cyber attack that disrupted a major port in Iran, done in response to an attempt by the Revolutionary Guards to infiltrate an Israeli water facility. There's the Iranian container facility that was shut down. And as I say, this was a response really to an earlier attempt by the Iranians to attack a water facility in Israel. So this is the sort of low-key, rarely hitting the newspapers, something short of acts of war that the cyber warfare has evolved into. It's never really hostile enough to create casualties. And from that point of view, it's just basically considered a cost of doing business by both nations. But this goes on every day. Only some of it reaches the surface of public knowledge. Let me talk for a bit about North Korea. Having discussed Iran, let's move on to North Korea. Here's an overhead view from a satellite. And the interesting thing is, of course, the comparison between South Korea, vastly lit up and electrified, and the North, which is really only the city of Pyongyang has electricity to speak of. This is a country where 40% of its inhabitants are malnourished. And yet, of course, they have somewhere between a dozen and maybe 20 or so nuclear weapons, plus the ability to deliver them with ICBMs and IRBMs. They just supposedly tested a new ICBM today. I'm going to say one thing about cybercrime, and I'll tell you why we're talking about this particular cybercrime in a moment. The SWIFT system is the interbank exchange, which is how banks send money to each other. There are millions of transactions every day across this network. In February of 2016, some attackers stole the credentials of an official of the Central Bank of Bangladesh, and they submitted requests to transfer a rather huge amount of money in small amounts, but a total of $951 million, almost $1 billion, in Bangladeshi funds held in the New York Fed to accounts, small banks in the Philippines. Well, it was noticed and stopped, but not before $81 million actually was transferred. And so a misspelling on one of the transfer reports due to ineptitude on the part of the criminals basically caused it not to be a much larger loss. Nevertheless, the NSA publicly identifies North Korea as the source for this. And notice that this is the first time a nation state has ever been accused of bank robbery. North Korea previously had a rather active counterfeit program, counterfeiting $100 bills. That was made more difficult, so they then became hackers and very much attacked the public network and actually earned some money out of it. So then we move on to a ludicrous, I would say, episode, if it weren't so serious. Some of you may remember a Seth Rogen movie called The Interview. It was supposed to be released in 2014, and it was about this gentleman. Supposedly, the interview was two American klutzes who were activated by the CIA to assassinate Kim Jong-un. And in fact, Kim Jong-un was the only one who really cared about the movie, and he instigated his hacker army to attack the Sony network, not Sony in Japan, but Sony in the US, the organization that was doing the movie, as a way to get them to halt the release of the movie. Sony networks suffered damage from wiper malware, basically destroying the computers. In December, then a week before the release date, the group that took credit for it, the Guardians of Peace, directly threatened theaters that were going to be opening and showing the theater. So Sony decided as a business gesture, they really had no choice but pull the movie from distribution. And then something odd happened. Obama was asked about it as a press conference, and he says, I think that Sony made a mistake. They should not have allowed another nation state to censor their program. And so even though this was a business decision, the US government had no skin in the game, as it were, Obama turned it into a freedom of speech issue and basically said the Sony was wrong by self-censoring. And oddly enough, at that point, the US also did one more thing. They apparently shut off internet to North Korea for a brief moment. Now North Korea's internet comes from China, so they had to work through China to do that. But they didn't do anything more hostile than just shutting it off, again, because the US probably weighed the risks of actually doing damage from China, which would have been noticed by China. So that was essentially the US response, a very small one, but again, it wasn't really a US government entity being affected. However, after that, Sony released the movie online on pay-per-view, and it's very soon became the best-selling online release ever. The theaters that did choose to open it were full, and it became a hit, garnering $40 million. I can tell you the movie is terrible by universal agreement, and yet it actually made money, so North Korea didn't quite get what they wanted. And North Korea afterwards said, issued this quote: "Obama always goes reckless in words and deeds like a monkey in a tropical forest." Well, that little bit of racism sounds to me in some ways like some of the worst dialogue in the Seth Rogen movie. Anyway, enough of that. On September of 2018, the U.S. tagged North Korea with the attack on Sony corporate network, and they actually attributed to North Korea now formally the attack on the Sony entertainment network, the one in California. And as a way of response, they actually issued a wanted poster and indicted the first gentleman, Park Jin-hyuk. The other two came later, but the U.S. knew quite well that this is not going to result in any arrests in China or in North Korea. Nevertheless, this is a way of U.S. announcing, by way of a 174-page criminal indictment here, that they knew exactly who did what, when, where, to whom, and that at the very minimum, these people are now identified as hackers. They can't set foot in the United States or they'd be arrested. But other than that, an indictment by the FBI of a foreign national doesn't really have a lot of effect. The effect is exposure. And exposure really matters, really, to hackers. So this is a way of hurting North Korea for having done this effort. But again, it's proportional. It wasn't an attack on a government facility. North Korea is the entity behind WannaCry, sometimes called WannaCrypt. I refer to it as WannaCrypt here. This is what it looked like. The screen is locked up to ransomware, and it says you can pay in Bitcoin to this address down here, $300. Thank you very much. Interestingly, the people behind this actually never had a way of tagging which people paid, if any, the $300, so there was no way of unlocking the file. So all of the poor people who paid the $300 ransom found it was useless. But in any case, this was issued actually by North Korea. It happened on May 12th, 2017. I remember that date because as it happened that very morning, I had given a talk on ransomware to Encore Learning. And that afternoon, WannaCry or WannaCrypt was all over the world in headlines. It was the fastest spreading ransomware by far. News stories highlighted the fact that it was based on a stolen tool by the shadow brokers. I don't have time to go into that right now, unfortunately. But nevertheless, it was a worm, not a virus. That's why it spread so fast. A virus basically has to be replicated by some action, some clicking on a link or whatever. A worm is not that. So a worm is a far more fast-spreading version of malware than a virus. On the other hand, worms are extremely rare. Nevertheless, that's why WannaCry was so bad, because it spread across the world really within minutes. And it had been using a patch that Microsoft actually 2 months earlier had actually fixed. So virtually no home computers in the West were vulnerable because they'd all been patched automatically by Microsoft. So they were not vulnerable to WannaCry. What computers were hurt then? Well, 3 categories. Those that were running ancient versions of Windows, which are no longer supported by Microsoft, or companies with corporate staffs that were so slow as to patch their systems that they got caught. And unfortunately, the National Health Service in England is one of those, or systems using unlicensed Windows. And that is true of many, if not most, computers in Russia and China. They are using bootleg versions of Windows. Therefore, Microsoft has no way of patching them. So they basically are exposed whenever there's a patch from Windows. And as I say, the NSA had notified Microsoft of this particular vulnerability. That's why it's been patched. And one other little crazy thing is a British researcher noticed that there was a website with a really long string of like 100 letters. And the action of the WannaCry ransomware was that it issued a call to this website. If there was a response, it stopped. It did not do anything. And he thought, well, that's interesting. He looked up and that website actually didn't exist. So he paid $10, set up the website. And from that point on, none of the WannaCry ransomware was effective at all. They all just issued the call to this website and became dead because of that. So accidentally, this British researcher actually stopped the spread of this dangerous ransomware in its tracks. Here's just a story by David Sanger on mentioned the North Korean hackers trying to steal $1 billion from the SWIFT system, and also a mention of the ransomware attack. And this is a note. Sheer luck enabled a 22-year-old British hacker to defuse the biggest North Korean cyber attack to date because of that kill switch, essentially. Chris Inglis, who's the former NSA deputy director, he's now the national cybersecurity coordinator, said you could argue that they, the North Koreans, have one of the most successful cyber programs on our planet, not because it's technically sophisticated, which it's not, but because it has achieved all of their aims at extremely low cost. And that's true. This is a classic example of why cybersecurity is different. It doesn't take much to inflict damage. And it's a lot cheaper than North Korea's nuclear system. Some wags on the internet, this is a joke, some wags on the internet said the real problem with WannaCry is that this Venn diagram, people who still use Windows XP and people technically savvy enough to use Bitcoin. Okay, I want to talk now about China. Definitely one of our foes in cyberspace. China has been at this game a long time, and I want to talk first about an iconic American company, Westinghouse. Some of you may know the origin story of Westinghouse in the 1890s. This gentleman and his partner, Nikola Tesla, managed to get the contract to light up the Columbian Exposition in 1893 with electric lighting. And on the strength of that, Westinghouse became, a fairly huge company in electricity. By the time of this century, they had developed a very lucrative business in nuclear reactors. And in fact, they owned about 50% of the nuclear reactor business. They had spent 15 years designing a new version of a nuclear reactor known as the AP1000. And in 2007, with great ceremony, Westinghouse, the CEO, sat down with President Xi in the Great Hall of the People and formally signed a document saying that Westinghouse would build 4 of these nuclear power plants in China. Fast forward 10 years, Westinghouse filed for bankruptcy. It is a company no more, other than just as a licensing as a name. I'm not saying that that was entirely due to what happened in between, but a lot of it was. At Westinghouse, management made other mistakes, but a good share of it, of the fact that Westinghouse is no longer a US company, is because, as was exposed in 2014, the People's Liberation Army, China military, basically had an ongoing campaign to hack Westinghouse. They had the designs for the AP1000. They were well aware of what the negotiating positions were from Westinghouse emails, and they very much used that information to strengthen their own Chinese capability to build nuclear power plants across China. So an incredible amount of intellectual property was stolen from Westinghouse and basically caused, at least in major part, the demise of the company itself. As a result, in May 2014, the US again indicted 5 Chinese nationals, all with the People's Liberation Army. And again, this had zero effect as far as they were concerned, except that the world now knew who they were, and the world also knew that the Chinese, as a government, as a military, very much sustained the enterprise of theft of intellectual property from private companies, private organizations. In fact, there was an ongoing campaign over years and years that targeted numerous defense contractors and US government agencies as well, generally attributed to the Chinese PLA. Billions of dollars of stolen intellectual property. This has been referred to as the largest transfer of wealth from one nation to another since the Portuguese essentially took all the resources of South America in the 17th century. And the attacks, however, have moderated in one regard, since there was a formal agreement between US and China to constrain their attacks. Let me just say that in May of 2014, the US issued that indictment, and approximately 7 or 8 months later, Xi actually came to the US to meet with Obama and agreed at the very last minute on an agreement in which both countries formally resolved not to hack each other's private sector targets. Did it work? Actually, yes. Far better perhaps than anybody thought it would. This is the attributions to Chinese military, and the hacking actually fell drastically. In 2016, I know there were companies in the cybersecurity business who actually blamed the reduction in Chinese hacking to the fact that they had, on why they hadn't met their financial targets for the year. But in any event, around 90% of the attacks were, in fact, China state-sponsored. Okay, let's talk very quickly about Russia, the Podesta files. This is how it happened. There was a bogus message sent to Podesta, said, hi, someone just used your password to try to sign into your Google account. Google stopped this sign-in attempt, but you should change your password. And then right here, there was a link that if you hovered over it, had this address. And that looks like it's Google, but of course it's not. It's in fact tiny.cc followed by a long list of letters, not printed here. That was the hack that allowed Podesta's emails to be achieved. This is a classic phishing email. Podesta, to his credit, or one of his aides, asked his IT department, is this real? And somebody's answered back, this is a legitimate email. John needs to change his password immediately and ensure that two-factor authentication is turned on. He can go to this link. This is the actual link to do both. It is absolutely imperative that this be done ASAP. Unfortunately, whoever did this went back to the original link, the bogus link. And as a result, just before the election, perhaps what is this, October 12th, so a month before the election, John Podesta's Twitter account says, I've switched teams, vote Trump. Okay. Apart from that, part 2 was a whole raft of emails that happened to come out, dumped to the public on the day of the Democratic National Convention as an attempt to foment discord between the group that was aligned with Bernie Sanders and the group that was aligned with Hillary. So timed Exactly. And it wasn't until after the election, December 29th, that the US intelligence service actually formally attributed that activity to Russia. Interestingly enough, it was actually two separate Russian groups. This is buried in an article in the Post at the time. One group, which CrowdStrike had dubbed Cozy Bear, had gained access last summer and was monitoring the DNC's email and chat. The other, which the firm named Fancy Bear, broke into the network in late April and targeted the opposition research files. It was this breach that set off the alarm. So two separate hacks by Russian intelligence organizations. In all likelihood, neither one knew that the other was in there. When the Democrats saw the activity, they assumed it was intelligence gathering, didn't think much of it, not realizing that it would be used not as intelligence gathering, but in fact as a damaging to, okay, FSB and the GRU. GRU is the military intelligence. This is Fancy Bear. FSB is the other group, Cozy Bear. Those are code names that are used. I'm sorry it's confusing, but the real entities behind them are two separate organizations in the intelligence community in Russia who are at each other's throats, both of them competing daily to get Putin's ear. So way back in the middle of 2015, well before the election, a year before, the FSB attacked the Democratic National Committee. The FBI actually noticed the attack and brought it to the attention of the Democrats, who, for one reason or another, ignored it. Then it wasn't until March that the GRU separately came into the Democrats' attacks, and then all of those emails were dumped at a maximum of, for maximum embarrassment, then in June of 2016. Okay, I'm going to move right along. The Russian social media campaign, I think you're all familiar with this. I'm going to talk, though, about one very small element of it, just to tell you how it worked. This involves the new US NATO nuclear weapons that are based in Turkey. If you recall, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US made a tacit agreement with the Russians to remove their nuclear missiles from Turkey, and they did very quietly. Nothing was ever heard about it. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the US equally quietly reinstalled those missiles in Turkey, and that also sticks in the craw of Putin. He's very much trying to get those nuclear weapons out. So Russian aggregators used fake news stories to suggest that these nuclear weapons were in danger of being lost to extremists, Muslim extremists. A very well-organized campaign by Russian bots, Russian accounts faked to look American or European, ensued. And for the next 24 hours, there was massive messaging across the social media that these nuclear weapons were about to be lost to Muslims. And of course, the story was completely bogus. All that was happening is the Joint Chiefs of Staff was arriving in Turkey, and that's why there was beefed up security. Nevertheless, Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign manager at the time, actually referred to it. He said, I mean, there's plenty of news to cover this week. This is Manafort speaking. You had the NATO base in Turkey being under attack by terrorists. So Manafort, wittingly or not, amplified the Russian propaganda, totally bogus story. And there are multiple types of response to it. Some types of messages were meant to suggest that the terrorists were about to grab the nuclear weapons. Others linked it to Benghazi. And then a third type wondered why the mainstream media wasn't covering this completely bogus incident. And so this became, for 24 hours, a matter of major discussion, particularly in conservative groups on Facebook. Here's one other element. The Russians used something called the Denver Guardian, which is a made-up newspaper, to float a story that says FBI agent suspected in Hillary emails leaks found dead of apparent murder-suicide. The real Denver Post found it necessary to issue a story headlining, "There's no such thing as a Denver Guardian despite the Facebook post you saw." That's typical. Nevertheless, that particular fake story, 15.5 million people saw it on social media. Here's another one. Denzel Washington supposedly is endorsing Trump. Pope Francis supposedly endorses Trump. Again, totally bogus. The only thing that Francis had said is back in February, he said that Trump's plan to build a wall along the US-Mexican border is, quote, not Christian. That's as close as Francis came to interfering in the US election. These sorts of messages were incredibly fast and furious in the days before the election. All of them completely false, but you can see that by the number of Facebook responses that they were in fact viewed massively, and in fact more than the honest news stories from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so forth, NBC News. Those major news outlets were all completely overwhelmed by the fake news stories in the late days before the election. So let me skip over I guess we have time to talk about the Solarwinds hack. This is also a Russian activity. There's a company called Solarwinds, and they are in the business of managing networks, and they offer software and products to do so. What's important about them is they are a very commonly used product in terms of managing corporate networks. And in fact, here's the CEO of Solarwinds bragging to networks, to the press in October 2020, before the Solarwinds hack, sort of. Thompson told analysts there was not a database or an IT deployment model out there to which his company did not provide some level of monitoring and management. We don't think anyone else in the market is really close in terms of breadth of coverage. We manage everyone's network gear. Well, true enough. And in fact, when Solarwinds was hacked, 33,000 customers were using a particular variety of Solarwinds software. 18,000 of those customers unwittingly installed the Russian malware on their networks. That means that the Russians now had entree into their network, should they choose to use it. And instead, the attackers focused on a few selected US government networks. And on December 7th, a few days before the breach was announced, the CEO of Solarwinds decided to retire, and oddly enough, hedge funds with ties to the board also sold large amounts of Solarwinds stock on the same day. So the SEC is looking into that now. But the point is that the hack was our old friend Cozy Bear, again, the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, breached emails, and this is the way it worked. This is a little bit unusual, so it's probably worth talking about. The Solarwinds company has a server with which it uses to upgrade its software to its customers. So on October 2019, test software with malware was installed and distributed. On March 2020, the backdoor, the malware, actually was installed and distributed to customers. Nobody knew it at the time. The malware was not detected until December. And then finally, the extent of the compromise was exposed. So for that 9 months, the hackers, whoever they were, owned 33,000 networks, commercial and government, plus a lot of non-governmental organizations. Nevertheless, okay, here's somebody saying that in general, the security at SolarWinds was terrible, and that is quite true. So of the 18,000 organizations that downloaded the malware, only 0.2% were actually received follow-on hacks, a backdoor to install a second stage payload. So the vast majority were not hacked, essentially, although they could have been. 40, however, were chosen and were indeed hacked quite successfully for 9 months. And again, this is a matter of this exemplifying the fact that this is an intelligence organization. There was not damage done. There was not data stolen and dumped. It was, in fact, following up very quietly and stealthily and remaining on the network until it was discovered 9 months later. Only about 40 networks actually had damaging information removed, but they were preponderantly government. Okay, so to summarize, and I think we're just about on time, we've talked about the 4 countries that we basically engage with as a hostile matter in cyber space, that being Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And each of them, you will note, has quite separate histories, quite separate objectives in cyberspace, quite separate abilities and capabilities. And so they all really have to be treated a little bit differently. But in general, I also talked about the US and Israel, for example, people on our side, nations on our side of the network. And all of them engaged in a daily activity of cyber warfare. One of the things that must be determined early on when there is a break-in is it should be determined, is this a nation state behind this, or is it a non-state actor? And that's a very important determination and sometimes relatively difficult to make, but it determines how the US responds to a particular break-in. If it's a non-state actor, it's a criminal activity, and the law enforcement community may well be able to take care of it, even if, to some extent, if it's an actor in another state. As you may know, cyber criminals are rather protected in Russia and China and North Korea, obviously Iran as well. So we can't directly go after them. Nevertheless, the definition of the activity as instigated by nation state versus non-state actor is a key early decision in responding. If it is a nation state, then you have to decide, is this an act of war or not? So far, all of the cyber activities have been short of the threshold of an act of war. However, we have certainly determined that there are things that we would consider an act of war, potentially even if it would be to be conducted by a non-state actor, perhaps, such as an attack on the U.S. infrastructure. If it is a nation state, an early decision then must be made in terms of how to respond. If it's an act of war, then obviously all bets are off, and it could even potentially lead to a shooting war. And the U.S. has developed a panoply of responses. We talked about some of them, but economic sanctions, definitely one of them. This is obviously in use really in all 4 of the nations that we've spoken of: Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia, and getting tighter all the time. Economic sanctions not necessarily having anything to do with cyberspace, but usable nevertheless as a way of invoking some sort of disciplinary response. As I mentioned, indictments are one method, and this doesn't result in any criminal response, but it is doxing. Doxing is based on the word documenting, and it's used by hackers a lot to expose each other when the hackers are fighting amongst each other. And indictments are a form of the US government essentially doxing nation states primarily, and to some extent criminals as well. The US can occasionally go after recovery of gain. You may recall that the US in the oil refinery Colonial Pipeline actually did go to the extent of recovering approximately 80% of the amount that had been paid. Note that the government did not return that money to Colonial Pipeline. They considered Colonial Pipeline somewhat at fault, so they did not return it to them. It went to the U.S. Treasury, and actually about 90% of the Bitcoins were recovered, but in the interim, the value of Bitcoins had fallen, so it was only 2.3 out of $4.4 million that was recovered. But that is one way of responding now. Financial punishments are also available, and these refer to locking up accounts of individuals or possibly governments as well. And that the U.S. can do as a result of its ability to react internationally in terms of the International Monetary Fund and so forth. And there is something called hacking back. And this is actually used a bit more. It wasn't until about 4 years ago when the intelligence community and cybercom in particular, not so much the intel community, was given a bit more power to actually go after the hackers overseas. The classic instance of this, you recall, in the election day of 2018, the organization in St. Petersburg that was actually responsible for much of the social media activity, and that also had been doing some hacking of state election databases, was shut down. They were actually shut down the day of the election in 2018 to prevent them from doing anything nefarious. So that's a case where the U.S. actually hacks back. Corporations do not have that power. In the U.S., the laws reserve the right to hack foreign nations to the military as an act of war under Title 10. So even if a corporation wanted to hack back the people that had hacked it, it would not be legal for it to do so. But the U.S. government is able to do that, and they do so on occasion. Open issues, very much debatable issues. Is an attack on a corporate network an attack on the U.S.? Well, it would seem not, but when people started lining up at gas stations because of the Colonial Pipeline attack, the perception was this was an attack on the U.S. Why isn't the U.S. government responding in kind? So this is not an issue that is easily resolved. The U.S. is not, by and large, responsible for corporate network security. So therefore, the U.S., in a sense, has limited responsibility for defending against it or for responding to such attacks. And yet every time it happens, particularly on a network that a lot of people are affected by, this becomes a debating point, and it will be probably forever. When are cyber weapons warranted? Again, this is something they're actually being used more now, I think, than they had even in the recent past. And so this answer is becoming a little bit moot. Nevertheless, there are times when cyber weapons per se probably are not the best approach, and you're better off relying on something like sanctions, for example. And finally, does Congress have a role? Congress constitutionally has the power to declare war, not the president. And Congress, to date, has really only been informed, quote unquote, consulted with, not so much, asked for, approval when cyber activities have gone on. I don't think this is going to continue. I think Congress probably should and will take a little bit more of a more active role in determining that, even though in some cases we're talking about hours or certainly days to respond. Nevertheless, Congress should have play a more role here than they do. On the other hand, they have somewhat ceded their role as with having the power to declare war as well. And there are some in Congress who want to change that, and some actually who are comfortable with leaving the president make that decision. Should the government disclose vulnerabilities when in software when it knows about it? The government spends a diligent amount of time trying to find vulnerabilities that are exploitable, so that can be used in operations of either an intelligence or a cyber weapon nature. Nevertheless, the U.S. does only infrequently informs vendors when there is a breach. They did in the case of the Microsoft because they knew that a foreign entity had access to it because it was stolen from the NSA. But in general, I would say the U.S. guards its secrets very carefully and is not inclined to inform vendors when there are exploitable vulnerabilities in software. There are exceptions to that, and the question is whether that is something that should continue or not. Very debatable issue.
Let's go ahead and handle some Q&A. So the first one is, I'm going to kind of combine a couple, but why doesn't every corporation, hospital, electric company have backup systems offsite for the computer system so that if they get hacked, they can just shut down their entire system, wait a day, then reload the back system? And kind of an ancillary question is, so the colonial pipeline you alluded to did not kind of handle things properly. How should they have handled that situation?
Okay, the answer to your first question is some do. The ones that do typically are the ones that have a very quantitative view of cybersecurity, and I'm talking mainly about banks. Banks and organizations such as the FDIC, for example. The FDIC spends enormous amounts of money actually having hot standby networks so that should a network get attacked, they can very quickly switch to a backup system. Backup in terms of logging software and data so that it can be restored in the event of a ransomware attack. Everybody pretty much does that. Outside of banks, people don't essentially have hot standby networks simply because they can't afford it, or at least they don't think they can, and they are essentially risking the loss of the data because as a cost of doing business, it would be too much money to completely have an unused backup standby network. But in terms of being able, if you are hit with ransomware on your personal computer, for example, hopefully you have cloud storage backup and you can just roll back to a version of your software prior to the ransomware being hit. Corporations can do that as well. So in many cases, not in all, they can actually do what you're suggesting. The other question was, how should Colonial Pipeline have responded? Is that?
Yeah, how should they have handled it or responded? Yes.
Well, as I say, they could have actually swallowed the loss and kept the oil and jet fuel moving. They would not be able to get paid for it because the tracking and the billing systems, parts of their systems were down, but they could do what Aramco did rather than to completely shut down the supply line and therefore paralyzing the whole eastern US. That's asking a lot as a business decision. They chose not to suffer that cost of giving away free oil. But again, the other thing I think that they, well, okay, that principally is that they could have knowing that their operational network had not been breached, they could have continued to operate it rather than to intentionally shut it down, therefore causing the damage.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Just to let the audience know, we are going to allow Tom some time to give some personal tips on how to protect yourself. We're going to try to get through some questions, more questions, so we may not actually get to the personal tips until close to the 4:30 time, may go a little over, but actually here's a couple that are questions that are related to personal protection I'll go ahead and do. One is, does the FDIC cover money that could be transferred / stolen from a customer's bank account due to a cyber attack?
No, not the FDIC, but by and large banks do. Just like credit card companies will eat any loss if your credit card is misused, even though it may partially be your fault if you don't tell them about it. The credit card companies consider that a cost of doing business. So the 2 or 3% that they lose to fraud, they essentially eat and do not allow customers to get to lose money. As far as banks are concerned, I don't think anybody, when a bank gets robbed, actually has lost personal accounts. The FDIC does insure accounts against loss if the bank goes under, but not specifically in the sense of bank losses due to cybersecurity type activities.
Well, yeah, I could just add to that because I did work in bank regulation. I mean, there is a regulation that was enacted when ATMs first came in, and it protects any kind of electronic loss. And I'm pretty sure that's been extended to any kind of cyber type loss, someone grabbing your account. And I know I've checked with my bank on that, so I'm pretty sure that's the case, that your money is protected. And also, still on the personal note, did the WannaCry attack hit Macs running Microsoft Word if the owner did not accept the patch? It's kind of very specific, but I guess if you can answer that.
The answer is no, because an attack on Microsoft operating system, not Word. Nevertheless, I do have to wonder why you would not accept patches from Microsoft for Word. Word has vulnerabilities and patches all the time too. So I would urge you not to disable patches on anything, certainly not from common Microsoft tools. But by and large, unless you are actually running Microsoft Windows on your iPhone, you would not be subject to the WannaCry.
Yeah, and then we have, this may open up a whole nother area, but you spend whatever time you want on it. So someone notes that the Washington Post has an article today about the Pegasus surveillance tool and targeting iPhones. And I know that is used very selectively, but maybe you can give some background on that and indicate if that's an increasing problem that people should worry about.
Yeah, let me say up front, I'm not an expert in cell phone security. That is a totally different, huge area by itself. But certainly the commentator is correct. Chat and messaging is where it's at right now on cell phones, both in terms of trying to obtain privacy and in terms of exploiting vulnerabilities. It's again, that's a daily warfare, by and large, as much a criminal activity as nation states, but every nation state has its own weapons in the cell phone area. I can guarantee you that the US was grateful that terrorists, by and large, depended on their cell phones in order to operate, because it became a trove of intelligence. And it continues to be, whether you were, for private citizens or for organizations or whatever. So be wary about cell phones, and I'm going to have to leave it at that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think the article does talk about the potential problem with governments targeting political dissidents and human rights activists with this tool that allows, I think, pretty much allows them to spy on you using your own phone, is what the article more or less was talking about. But I guess people are interested in that. I will put the link. You should be able to see it in the answered questions, and maybe you can read more about that. So, another question: Can you talk about the long-term attack on the U.S. government and expose personal files? Maybe that's referring to something a while back or recently. I know that a number of government files, personal officer had been exposed. I'm not familiar with all the number of times that's happened, but maybe you can address that.
I think the questioner is asking about the attack on the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM. This is in 2014. The most significant files taken were the so-called SF-86, the voluminous report that everybody like me fills out who obtains a clearance. That was definitely an activity of an intelligence nature and was almost definitely attributable to the Chinese. So the virtue of having that information, if you're Chinese intelligence, as you now know, pretty much everybody outside the CIA and the US government who has a clearance, and you can begin to select what individuals might be useful to try and turn into assets. So that information definitely was a huge loss to the OPM. Again, significantly, the entity doing the hack was on the OPM machine for over a year before it was detected. So that's a major faux pas. So it was only really after that extremely valuable data was lost that the US and the US intelligence community and government really began to tighten their systems. But that is an ongoing issue as well, but that OPM breach was massive, absolutely massive.
Okay, this I think is an interesting area. So does the migration of corporate networks to the cloud make things better or worse?
I would say in general better, simply because now you're relying on professional cybersecurity professionals from larger organizations. You don't have to spend a lot of money yourself on fending off attacks. By and large, the cloud vendors do that for you. And there are some downside risks as well. And anybody who's using cloud to move corporate secrets into the cloud should be aware of those. But by and large, this in general makes it harder, I think, for criminals to exploit most corporate networks.
Okay, I think, you know, we have, I think in the interest of time, we want to move to the your discussion of how people can protect themselves, and also just, I think someone was wondering where they can get a copy of the recording. Hopefully, we'll have it up on the Encore Learning site. It'll be a link to our YouTube site, and we might have had a glitch in the recording, but I'm hopeful that it's we've been able to catch it all. So that's how you can find the recording hopefully in a few days. So with that, Tom, why don't you go ahead and talk about things that people can do to protect themselves?
Sure, and let me also point out that there's a reason I put my email up there. If any of you has a question that you feel I can answer, go ahead and feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to talk to you that way, or provide any feedback you want. I'm delighted to get emails on this subject, and hopefully be able to help things out. So what can we do to protect ourselves? The number one method that people have of breaking into computers is so-called phishing attacks. These are emails that are not what they purport to be. This is an email I received long ago. Supposedly it is from my sister-in-law. This is her name, Marita Sharon. She and I interact publicly over Facebook and elsewhere. And so that's public knowledge, I guess, that she and I are friends. However, although this looks to be from Marita Sharon, it is clearly not, and that's because this is the actual name of the email address that sent it. And it's obviously not Marita Sharon. This is somebody else who is pretending to be Marita Sharon. And this is a hostile link, happens to have a .ru in the URL, which tells me that it is in fact Russian-based. And this is a well-known spam server, actually, news3420.ru. But my point is, if you take nothing else away from this talk, please distrust the name that is on emails. that name, purported name, is actually in the spec for email, it's actually called the alias, because it's almost intended to be fake. I could change my email reader to send out emails from Barack Obama or Donald Trump or whatever, and anybody who didn't look beyond that to see the actual email address would think it was from me. So be very wary about emails that you get. If there are attachments or links, recognize that those may well not be what they look like. Second is be wary when using public Wi-Fi. Let's say you're in Starbucks and you want to go online, so there is a wireless access point somewhere behind the walls, and you can then sign on online from your laptop and do your thing. Well, recognize that the person a couple of tables over may well be spoofing that wireless access point, in which case he potentially can be a conduit for your access to the internet, and unbeknownst to you, grab all of the traffic, including passwords and so on. So be very wary in airports, in public spaces when you're using public Wi-Fi. I would not do banking transactions on this. One option you can use is VPNs, but in general, be wary about the public spaces and public Wi-Fi capabilities. Don't use Wi-Fi to log into important accounts. And in my case, that would be, my money accounts, the banks and brokerage houses and so on. I never do that on a public wireless network. Simply is not a good thing to do. Or you can consider using a virtual private network, and you can Google that to find out what that is. So in terms of what you should do, be wary of email links and attachments. You should never turn down patches. Patches are good for you. And if you don't patch, sooner or later, you're going to get hit, because every time a vendor issues a patch, the bad guys go to work on that patch and immediately create exploits for it. So unless you're patched, you're going to get hit. Install a good security tool. There are numerous ones out there on the market. One thing I suggest is all of the tools are free for at least limited usage. So every so often, if you want, if you have the time, go ahead and get one of the tools, download it and run it on your network, do a scan. If it finds something great, you may want to consider actually paying for that tool. If you don't, fine, that means the tool you have is doing a good job. So if you're recommend the tool I use is Malwarebytes, but there are many others out there that are good. As long as they're from a reputable company, again, the Google searches will help you with that. And as I say, they're all free, although you can pay money for them. I like to pay money just because I know how much work goes into making a good security tool. A password manager I recommend as a way to keep complicated passwords updated. These are also free by and large, or you can pay a modest amount of money. When you are surfing in your browser, you should have a way of displaying scripting languages, particularly JavaScript, and another language called Java, which is not the same as JavaScript. And all of these can be entry points for hostile activity. So look how to do that on whichever browser you're using. Some of them, they're add-ons. Some of them now, you can just basically change a setting in your browser. And finally, use two-factor authentication if you can. They are a pain in the butt, but they are actually useful, particularly on the accounts that matter to you, which is to say your bank account, or your brokerage account or whatever, something where you do not want to essentially give away the store. On the other hand, two-factor authentication is coming more and more into attack because people attack the text system. Text is on their cell phone is how people get the one-time password. And if your cell phone is attacked and you're using the cell phone to get access the tool, sometimes an attacker can actually get the one-time password and use it before you do, in which case you would be locked out. You should notice that and report that immediately to the vendor. And finally, don't surface an administrator. This is for the truly paranoid. and is not recommended in general. I don't think it's necessary, but the key here is that by default, you will be surfing the web with administrator privileges, which means that should you be hacked by something on the web, that malware will be acting at administrator level. You'll get a notice saying, do you want to allow this? And if you ever do get that and it's unexpected, you should absolutely say no. But if you're truly paranoid, you can surf the web as a regular user account. And then should you be subject to malware at that point, the bad guys would only have the lesser user capabilities rather than the full administrator privileges. So that in a nutshell is what I'd recommend in terms of how to protect yourself online. And again, if you have other questions, please feel free.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was trying to jot down notes. I think that was very, very helpful. Hope everyone else found that useful. And thank you, Tom, for just a very informative presentation. We had a very good crowd that joined us. Do you have any kind of final words to summarize the topic?
David, except be careful. I think that as personal users, we have a chance far more than network administrators and corporate networks do. And I do also want to thank you, David, and the rest of Encore for putting this together.